Thank you, Aella, for coming on and joining me on the podcast today. Really appreciate you taking the time. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while now. You've got a really interesting story, and a lot of people may already be familiar with it, but or with you. But for those who aren't, would appreciate if you could just start sort of as early as possible and talk about your story and some of the decisions you made along the way and where you are now and what you're doing.
Thank you for having me on. That is such a gigantic question. It's like, tell me about every facet of everything.
Yeah, ideally you
But
take the full hour and I don't have to ask any more questions, and it's just super interesting.
okay, I will try not to disappoint you, but I might need some help. Um, let's see. Yeah, I was born 1992 to a very excited person about Christianity. My dad is a professional evangelical person. He does defense of the Christian faith. And so when I was born, I think he was employed as an assistant pastor, but not doing very well with that because he doesn't have a great personality. And so my mom was also a stay-at-home housewife. So we were super conservative. And over my childhood, my dad basically started up his company, founded his own research ministry. And so my childhood was full of intellectual defenses of the Christian faith. I performed my first witnessing to Jehovah's Witnesses at the age of 7 when I asked them if they believed in the Trinity at a Taco Bell. And my parents were very proud of me. And yeah, our culture was super conservative. Is we're complementarianism we were into. So wives are supposed to sort of stay at home, be housewives. The idea is you are kind of a little bit separate but equal-esque. So our access to media was highly filtered. We had a thing installed on the television that would delete scenes from movies that were too inappropriate. So for example, I watched the Titanic and I had no idea that the two main characters had sex or that there was that nude scene. People would reference scenes from the Titanic and I was so confused later on in life because I didn't even know anything had been deleted in the first place. They're homeschooled, obviously. All of the people we talked to were homeschoolers. I memorized 800 verses over my childhood years of the Bible. It was just an extremely religious, extremely traditional kind of environment. It's just the general overview of it, which this is kind of relevant because I am now a sex worker. So the contrast is the fun part. I got out of that. I went to college, or I attempted to, for a couple of months, but I wasn't able to afford it. And that was when I lost my faith, and also had sex for the first time. It was very big. And sort of the transfer to the outside world was really disorienting. I felt like I had come from a totally different culture from the people around me, but the people around me had no way of making sense of the culture I had been from. It wasn't like I was visually different. It wasn't like people could look at me and be like, oh, that's somebody from this culture. And sort of we know how to communicate what the cultural differences are. It was more like I just didn't understand a lot of what people talked about because so much is informed by pop references or references to music or TV or celebrities or memes that I just had no idea. It was really baked into culture. Also school life. A lot of what people talk about when they're young adults is sort of how school formed them. And I just had no sense of lockers, break, what's the period bell. This was stuff that totally went over my head. And I felt really isolated for quite some time. But anyway, lost my faith, which it's strange to have such an unformed prompt where I'm kind of randomly thinking about memories and kind of talking about ones that pop into my head. But you did say that you prefer longer over shorter, so I can try and give random details.
That I did. And I have a question maybe you can address as a little break. I'll do talking
Yeah.
for just a second. Was college always an obvious thing that you thought or your parents thought you were going to do? Because to your point, growing up homeschooled, very sort of censored what you could take in and learn, and just a very different experience. Going to college just sort of drops all the walls at once, it seems, and you just are sort of thrown into this totally new and different environment where, not everyone's similar, but on average, most of these kids probably weren't homeschooled. Most of these kids probably didn't grow up with the religious sort of teachings that you had received. So very different. I'm curious if that was like an obvious thing or sort of a something that was controversial.
Yeah. Um, we were very strongly prepped for college. We were there are a lot of immunization going on, such as like statistics, like 75% of all Christian kids who go to college lose their faith within 2 years, or something like that. And so we were, like throughout our entire childhoods, it was hammered into us like when you go to college, people are going to try and make you lose your faith, and like you can't do that. So I think my parents felt relatively safe in that it was prepped in me like pretty significantly. And I also was like way more immersed in Christianity than a lot of other Christian kids were, especially ones that went to public school. So I think my parents thought that afforded me some protection. It was expected that I would go to college, not like very strongly, but a little bit. It was sort of like, oh, if you can, you can. My younger two sisters both have not gone to college either. And I couldn't go due to financial reasons. Like my parents made too much money for me to qualify for financial aid. But they wouldn't help me financially for college whatsoever because they had the philosophy of like, once your kid leaves home, like you don't help them. And they also wouldn't co-sign on any loans, so I couldn't get any loans. So that's why I couldn't actually I only could go for a few months, and then they wanted the payment to be worked out, and then I couldn't. And so that's why I got kicked out. But yeah, and the general mentality behind me going to college was I remember asking my mom at one point very directly, I'm like, why am I going to college if I'm just going to stay at home and be a housewife? Like, what the fuck is the point? And she was like, well, you need to get educated so that you can teach your kids, so you can homeschool. Like, it's good to have a background to be a better teacher. And also, like, you're very likely to meet a husband there, like a good Christian husband. And so, like, okay, I didn't really like see the point, but it's kind of what everybody did.
Yeah, it's interesting because the rest of the background wasn't really following or having much regard for what everyone else did, but then college is sort of this traditional milestone and thing that people do, and I guess that makes sense. The reasoning. I was just curious. It sort of seems like stepping outside of this world that you grew up in and going somewhere very different, and it seems like they prepped you for people trying to convince you to drop your faith, and that obviously ended up coming to fruition sooner than later. It sounds like you were getting into sort of how that happened or played out. And I'd
Oh
read a blog
yeah.
about it, but I'm curious to hear sort of the voiceover on what went down.
Yeah, I think they didn't expect, and neither did I, like the mechanism by which faith changes happen. At least in me, and I suspect this was common for a lot of other people too. Like, I think the idea was, oh, if you know all of the arguments against Christianity and you know all the answers, of course, you're not going to be convinced of any of the arguments, and you're going to hold on to your faith. I think they didn't anticipate the impact of just different culture. Like when I was prepped for the world, I was told a lot of things like people who are not Christian are sinners. You can't really trust them as much. They're not like driven by grace. So you have to kind of be on guard around these people. It was very like othering of them, despite a lot of lip service to the contrary. And so I went into it like already othering them myself. Like I was put in a dorm room with this other girl, and she was like bisexual, and that was the first time I'd met anybody who was not straight, at least openly. And I was like really horrified by it. And I was like, okay, I have to witness to this girl, maybe like be a good Christian example. But it was definitely like, oh, she is of the other. She has been like co-opted by Satan in some way. She's like sinful and doesn't know it. I have to save her. So it's very much that attitude. But I think over like long-term exposure to people in college, it sort of that attitude faded. Like I became friends with people, and I kept like regularly seeing people act like pretty similarly to the way that my Christian peers did in a lot of ways. And I think that sort of broke down some sort of deep thing. Like instead of becoming us versus them, it became like, oh, like they are one of me in some way. And I think that made it less terrifying to adopt a different perspective. I don't think this was conscious. I think this was like extremely subconscious and happening in the background. I don't think I really formed this narrative about it until much later. But there was some way where like Christianity was tied to a lot of social survival things. Like if I wanted social acceptance or, a place to stay or people to like me or to be loved, like I had to be Christian. And then once I had other people who weren't Christian, who I knew they would still like support me and love me, even if I lost my faith, I think that like allowed me to actually consider that maybe my faith was not true. Like I did not have that in my mental landscape whatsoever before that point. And so once I hit that, and then like I ran into some problem about the Christian faith, which is like, some inconsistency in the Bible that I hadn't heard before. The Christians, by the way, have like a decent response to, but I hadn't heard that. And so once I ran into this inconsistency in the Bible, that plus the realization that, like, if I lost my faith, it would be okay. That finally like switched me over. And within the span of like 30 seconds, my faith was gone. And it was very terrifying.
Wow, yeah. It sounds like it was more of a like a straw that broke the camel's back than anything else, where it wasn't probably this one counter argument that really was so mind-blowing versus just sort of the build up and the loss of this sort of us versus them and realizing that there's sort of other options out there and people seem to be fine and kind of similar to you in many ways that sort of prepped you and then just the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
So you lose your faith in college and like get kicked out right after, or how's that work?
I mean, the kicking out was due to the financial problems. I was only there for like 3 months, so I don't actually remember the timeline, but sometime in those 3 months, very classic. You go to college for only 3 months and lose your faith. It was probably near the end because I think it took me quite some time. Actually, it might have been longer than that because I stayed with my boyfriend at the time, who was in a dorm. I think after I got kicked out, uh, so yeah, it may have even been after 3 months, but yeah. So at that point, I was in northern Idaho, and I was like, okay, I can't get educated, so I have to get a job. And I worked as a factory worker, which to me was great because at the time I had been applying to like sewage sludge worker, like that was what I was ready to do. I was like, anything it takes to feed me, because at that point, like the best I could hope for was kind of being a housewife, and like my mom's scope of life was really small. I just talking to her about my finances today, and she was like, damn, when I was your age, like I didn't think I would ever own a house. Like that was just not in the scope of what was possible. And so at that point, it was very similar. I was like, the best I can hope for my life is like maybe becoming like promoted a couple levels off of a gas store cashier worker. Like that was, I didn't think I would ever do anything greater than that. Um, and so I applied to sludge stuff because that's right. I mentioned I was going hungry at that point. I remember like I moved into this house where I rented a room for like a couple $100s. And I remember them showing me the fridge, like when they were showing me around the house when I was moving in. And I asked like, oh, so is there how do roommates treat each other's food? And they reassured me. They're like, oh, don't worry, nobody's going to eat your food. But what I had actually been trying to ask is like, can I eat anybody else's food? Because I was so hungry.
Hmm.
Anyway, so I got a job at a factory, which was many, many hours a week. I worked, had to wake up at like 4 a.m. or something to go to work, and went home after the sun went down because it was northern Idaho. It was really shitty. I drank a lot. But I've tried really, really hard to be happy. I was like, I'm glad I have a job that pays a little bit more than minimum wage. And they fed us lunch on Fridays. Very nice. And then, but on the weekends, somehow I managed to like kind of do hobbyist photography. And then I got hired eventually by this like boudoir company. They fired me 2 weeks after that, but uh, but like that caused me to quit my factory job when I went to the photography thing. And when they fired me, I just couldn't bring myself to go back to the factory job. I was like, I have to try something else. I have to try anything else. But I had some in savings at that point, so I went back to Boise and stayed on a friend's couch. And that's when I discovered camming, being you could just like broadcast yourself online, show your boobs, and make some money. And I was like, that's incredible. I don't even have to wake up at 4 a.m. And that's how it all started.
Yeah, it's interesting as an alternative to waking up at 4 a.m. and working in a factory and like just scraping by. I'm sure anything sounds pretty good, but I heard like a description you gave because you're like I don't know, it just seems like apparent to me, and even people listening I think probably already get the gist, but especially reading some of your writing, like you're obviously just like smart and just generically speaking just smart, and so people wonder like, okay, well, how does like this smart person end up working 4 a.m. in a factory and then going and being a cam girl. um But you talked about how like, some people end up in the industry as sex workers. A number of people turn to the industry because they're already sort of on the outskirts of society and like not couldn't figure out, but it was just like sort of a last ditch effort of something to do that worked out. But then there's a whole another category that's like largely underrated or ignored of people who just realize that like they just sort of think about things differently and they realize that this is actually like a pretty low time commitment, high, highly compensated way to make some money. And it's like pretty reasonable from a certain angle. How did you think about it like at that time when it sounds like you were maybe more like in the former category, but more recently, like over the years, it sounds like you're definitely sort of in that latter category, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're right. There's this sort of dichotomy, like people who get into it because they have to, and people who get into it because they want to, in a sense. Usually the people who get into it because they want to, it's like they're in college that maybe their parents are paying for, and they like they want some extra spending money. They start sex work and then find out that it's paying them like a lot. And so they sort of keep going, and maybe they quit college and maybe they make a career out of the sex work. And for me, this was not the case. I definitely entered sex work because I had to, not because I wanted to. But at that point, I was already pretty promiscuous, so it wasn't that hard. I think my like upbringing around sex was pretty confusing because it was like, as I mentioned, extremely repressive. I wasn't told that I had a vagina until like age 11, and so when I lost my faith, I was sort of like, okay, everything that I've been taught is a lie, maybe. I don't know. So how do I go about doing things like sex, for example? And so I sort of reconstructed from first principles. And my first principles were is that if it feels good, then I should do it, right? So I just had sex with a bunch of people. I would just like randomly approach men and be like, would you like to engage in coitus? And then we would just bang because that's just what I figured. Like, oh, it feels good. It feels nice. I'll just do this a lot. So I didn't really have the social conditioning in a sense, or like I reset the social conditioning. And that's what made me like pretty inclined to sex work, I think, or like made me kind of adapt to it pretty well. Because I was like, well, if all bets are off, like why not try this thing? Um, it was definitely pretty scary though. I remember the first time I was, pumped full of adrenaline and I had to drink a lot to be okay with it. But yeah, you're right. Over the years, it's gotten to the point where I could probably quit sex work and get sort of a normal job, but it's hard, right? Because like I don't have an education. I haven't been like I don't have experience working in companies. Like all of my experience is building my own business by myself. And so there's not a lot of skills I have that seem like directly transferable to a job where you sort of report to somebody else and work on a project that's not yours. Um, so I don't actually know. It's probably untrue that if I quit sex work fully, that I would be sort of out on the street and unable to make money, but it really feels like that. It's always felt like that. I always feel like there's like no other option I have. Although I did just get funded for a research institute. So I actually announced that I'm going to quit OnlyFans for now, or at least I'm taking a 3-month break from OnlyFans. And if the research institute is doing really well, then I'm just going to stop. So I actually have managed to transfer out as of like a couple of weeks ago, which is pretty great.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
awesome. And congrats on the research project. I guess I'm trying to like reconcile in my head, like from sort of listening to you on other podcasts and reading some of your writing, it seemed to me that this like broader category of, sex work, whether it's OnlyFans or anything of the like, um, these were things that you sort of it didn't seem like you were just doing them for the money. Like I guess if money was not an issue, it seemed to me that you would maybe continue doing them for not that the money wasn't part of it, like certainly is, maybe the biggest part, but um, it's sounding to me more now like if money wasn't an issue for you, you wouldn't really be doing any of this stuff at all. Is that the case, or it's hard to sort of say?
Yeah, that's currently the case. I don't, it's mostly just that I'm burned out because I've been doing it for so long. It's a decade. Like when I first started, it was genuinely fun. It was super creative, open atmosphere. I could, broadcast anything I wanted. And I made up super crazy creative shows that have been lost to time, unfortunately. But I really poured my heart and soul into it. And it was really fun. And the same was also when I started OnlyFans. I was like, ooh, cool. There's like a new problem to solve. Like I want to pour my soul into figuring out this system to make the maximum amount of money. But then the thing is, like once you figure it out and it becomes rote, then it's no longer fun. So at this point, like I wouldn't be doing it if I weren't getting paid. Um, but it's not to say that like the initial stages were not like pretty novel and awesome.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I understand like you have quit before, at least for some period of time, right? I'd read
Yeah.
that like that was you'd quit for a little bit to start a crypto project, which
But
is a
yeah.
little bit more familiar probably to my audience who's listening. Can you tell us about, what that was, how you got even, exposed or involved in crypto in the first place? Just, it's sort of there's already been a couple of in your story, a couple of like sort of untraditional transitions, I would say, and then this one like slapped on top of it all is like, whoa, okay, now she's doing a crypto ICO.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's true. I'd been in crypto for a while at that point. I bought my first Bitcoin in 2014. Many of them, because at that point they were didn't cost anything. Uh, so I would always been a fan of crypto. As soon as I heard about it, even when everybody else told me that I was insane for buying in, I was like, I don't care if I'm insane. This supports the kind of future that I want to see. Because I'm like pretty libertarian. I'm like decentralized money, absolutely, fuck yes. Anyway, so ended up selling it when it hit 300. So I'm not like a multimillionaire. Um, but yeah, so I've been in and out of crypto and around crypto for a long time. And I had a friend who was going to start an ICO thing. And he was basically like, I'll pay you if you quit sex work to go come do data here. And I was like, absolutely, yes, please. It didn't really matter to me so much what the ICO was. I just like, at that point I was scamming, super, super burned out. I was desperate for anything else. So that's when I went and joined this ICO, which I kind of don't want to name because like it was not a great experience. Not a great company either. I still like kind of it was for dating. It was like monetizing dating on the blockchain, and some of the principles behind it were really cool, and I still stand by it. But the company was like run by people who are very inexperienced at running companies, and so I dropped out of it. I think under a year after that, and that's when I started escorting.
Okay, so escorting, can you tell me about that? I don't even know what exactly that means.
Yeah, having sex with people IRL for cash. I was living in New York at the time because the ICO project had moved to New York. And that we were living in a big loft with only one room, but 6 people, very cramped. And I was not making enough money. And I was like, hey, I want to go back into sex work, but I can't be camming anymore. I'm so burned out. So I talked to a friend who's an escort and she gave me the lowdown of how to do it. And then I put in my ads, started a website, took some photographs, and then started seeing clients in New York. And I think I started out charging $800 an hour and then raised it to 1,000 a couple of months later. And then a couple of months after that, raised it to 1,200. So yeah, they would email me and I would screen them. So like ask them information about themselves that makes it more safe, check them against blacklist. Then I would meet up at a hotel with them. And then typically the appointments around 1.2 to 2 hours. And then we would have sex and I would leave with a bunch of money in my pockets. And it was really great.
So sounds like that was a welcome change from camming. And I'm not like I sort of have an idea of what camming is, but how did the experiences, I guess, like compare and contrast for you? It sounded like, same industry, but very different day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally prefer escorting. Out of all of the forms of sex work I've done, escorting is the best for me. And just in the way like the work feels, because camming, which for those unfamiliar, is like you broadcast a webcam and there's like a chat box next to you. It's like when you're watching porn sites and there's a pop-up being like, come chat with me live. Like that's typically a cam site. And this is very asymmetrical. So it's like one to many, and you have to sort of appeal constantly to the lowest common denominator, the most like generic form of appeal. And you have to do things like set the men against each other for competitions. It's very like, it's sort of depersonalized in a way. And in that, it's totally the opposite with escorting. That's where you meet a person, you're one-on-one with them, and your job is to seduce like this human being, and then you have sex with like this one person, and it feels so much better and healthier. And I like it so much more. Like I was able to get like way stronger like emotional hits out of that. Like I really liked a lot of my clients, and it was actually pleasurable to see them in a way that like it just wasn't possible with camming. I still liked a lot of my camming clients, but like there was no way to bond with them that like that. because it was, you always just have to be handling the rest of the room too.
Right. So last question on this subject, I think at least. So where did you sort of land? Like, where are you? I guess how many years ago was this that you were doing the escorting in New York? And then, you don't have to walk through like the whole timeline, but just I'm curious where you landed now in terms of like I know what's it called? OnlyFans is sort of a new platform. What like format did you sort of land with, and I guess why?
Yeah, I did. I started escorting in late 2018, and then I started OnlyFans around when COVID hit. I think April of 2020. So I escorted for like a year and a half or so, 2 years ish, and then COVID hit, and then like people just weren't seeing people anymore, and like the business was really slowing down. And then some of my old cam girlfriends were like, "Hey, OnlyFans is popping off. People are making a lot of money here." So I switched back over to OnlyFans, and then made 13 grand my first month, and then like 50 grand my second month, and then my third month was 100 grand, and then I made 100 grand for the next 3 months in a row. So after that, that was the fun part. That was the wee money obsession. Um,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, that's like a lot of money for anyone doing anything. So I guess if you don't feel comfortable sort of stepping away and doing other things now, do you maintain like a relatively high cost of living, or you've just sort of gotten used to the money and like to make a lot of money? How do you think about that? Because some people, and I want to also get into like the psychedelics bit. It seems unrelated, but I think down that path, you talked about like, having basically no desires. Like some people can sort of limit their desires, especially like material desires or just comforts of living to sort of be happy and satisfied on like a relatively low spend. Like digital nomads, for example, traveling the world, like living in hostels, things like that. Um, how has your relationship with money changed over time from obviously, really struggling around the time of college to making 100 grand a month?
yeah, that's a great question. It's really weird. It's so weird how like fast your relationship to money changes once you get more of it. Like how quickly you normalize. Um, I I'm not making that much anymore. I made 100 grand for 3 months, and then rapidly dropped off after that, just because I couldn't force myself to do to do all of the routine stuff anymore. So I'm not super rich as a lot of people seem to think that I am. Taxes are super high, especially when you're self-employed, and I was living in
Hmm.
California at the time. So it was just excuse me. I saved most of what I got anyway, or at least like 50% or something. Um, my standard of living right now is not super high. It's like definitely higher compared to where I was from Idaho. But like if I didn't earn any money and I just lived, I could probably make it like another 5 years pretty easily. Um, so I'm not like burning through cash like crazy right now. But it's really strange, like especially when I go back and visit my parents, like really differing attitudes towards money, because I make so much more than my parents do, and it's just, and so it's like weird to be like the rich person in the family. I'm not even rich. Um, but crypto's also helped a lot. I've been investing in crypto over the last few years, which has been like a really good idea.
Yeah, that's worked out pretty well. And it's interesting. Your response is like not really what I expected. Um, in regards to like, a 5 year runway, that's actually like a really long runway. And I imagine your cost of living, $100,000, like you said, with taxes, it was only for a few months. You're making less. Subsequently, like it's not that much money after taxes and everything to have a 5 year runway. It sounds like you are saving a lot. Obviously, you're investing in crypto, it certainly helps. Um, but with that runway, like, have you ever, I swear I'm not trying to like convince you to quit or anything. I think you should do what you want to do. But I'm just curious if you've considered like taking time and just, I know like you have a company now. I think the company is just not just, but, you're working on the card game, right? I imagine it's not like a crazy amount of input in terms of your time. Have you considered sort of just like dropping everything, letting yourself have a ton of free time and, figuring out what you want to do next, or you feel like you're already sort of past that and wouldn't gain a lot from that sort of like gap year or gap period type of experience?
No, you're right. I think that's good advice. I think like I'm sort of afraid of it. Like I'm afraid because like I think a lot of my friends, like for example, are programmers. And so if they take a year off and then they need money again, they can pretty easily go get a programming job. And for me, the thing is, if I want to come back, I have to do sex work again. And it's like I'm getting older, you know, I taking a year off is scary. I feel like I'm supposed to do it all right now. I'm turning 30 soon, and like income really starts dropping around 35. So it's like, do I really want to take the 1 out of 5 years off? So that sort of thing has been like really scary for me. I feel like very immense time pressure. But I think you're right. Like, I think at this point, maybe I should just trust it, which is why I am actually taking the break now from OnlyFans, like possibly quitting permanently, because I got funding for that research institute. So it depends if I can continue to get funding. I would love to just be a researcher. That's my dream, my whole life. I just want to sit and research all day, every day. But we might be in that direction. I should probably just like trust in the process more, huh?
Yeah, I mean, like I appreciate your sort of openness to the question. I myself like have experienced a couple of times, first in college and then with my first job out of college, just quitting without well, the first time left to try to start a company, the second time I quit just knowing that what I was doing wasn't for me and not knowing what was next. And both
Mm,
times ended super beneficially for me, at least from my own perspective, looking back. Of course, you can never know how things might have gone had I stayed on those tracks. But I mean, I think you might be underrating yourself a good deal. Like I could, I think you might be overrated, not to be critical or whatever, but like might be overrating certain like experience and expertise within industry and positions. Like I'm sure you could do like a ton of things. One of which I imagine could be like helping companies, um, maybe even crypto companies like build their brands. You've obviously done like a tremendous job of this, and it's been sort of, OnlyFans oriented or whatever, but you've got like a ton of following on Twitter. From my perspective, you could do basically anything you want, but it sounds like the thing that you want to do most is research. Can you talk more a bit about the project that you got funded and what you hope to do there?
hmm. First of all, like thanks for that. It's like it's useful to hear that. I think like I have some sort of cultural disconnect from people who work in mainstream jobs. Then that sort of lack of knowledge sort of makes me think like I just don't know how to do anything because it's just so like I don't know what the norms are for that sort of world, in ways that like maybe are hard to predict because like most people in that world like sort of take a lot of the knowledge for granted. Um, but yeah, so with my current research, I'm looking at sexual fetishes. I got funded to study sexual fetishes and publish about them. Um, there's so much just to learn about them. I have so many questions. I've done like some preliminary surveys, which just like cause more questions. Because the current state of sex research in academia, from what I understand, talking to people in academia is absolute shit. Like nobody can research anything because you have to get board approval. And I don't have those kinds of stipulations. So I have a lot more freedom and I have fucking gigantic sample sizes. So I'm really excited about it.
So how does this like come from, connect this back to what I see you like doing on Twitter? I think you're serving them via other formats as well. You're doing like a lot of polls. And I think it's interesting. Like I've done a few polls on Twitter or, several dozens, whatever it might be over the last couple of years I've been on Twitter. And like the functionality to me, like I haven't really, it's just sort of interesting to me to do once in a while, but it's relatively like there's not a whole lot you can do with the Twitter poll, at least from my perspective. But I've seen you doing like quite a bit, like step one, I think of what I've seen you do that I haven't really thought to do is like these two-part polls where you're then sort of like correlating things or whatnot. But how do you sort of approach polling on Twitter? I guess where did you start doing that in the first place? Like where did that motivation come from? And translate that to sort of this next step professionalized like research project.
Yeah, Twitter polls are great. I think they get a bad rap because people are like, oh, Twitter polls are not scientific. I feel like there's this whole like aesthetic around science. And if you don't match the science aesthetic, then people are like, oh, that's not valid or that's not scientific without like deeply understanding why. Like, I think my Twitter polls are a lot more scientific, quote unquote, than a lot of things that are published in academic journals, which is absolutely ridiculous. But with Twitter, you can do a lot of things to check. like, for example, I repeat polls over years to see how things are changing and to see sort of how stable things are. Like sometimes I retweet polls that I would expect to remain stable. Like, would you rather lose the ability to sing or to swear, for example? And so you can see like how reliable Twitter polls are across time, or how much is due to noise. I wish you can do like statistical analysis on that. But besides that, you can do things like sometimes I ask people, for example, like what are you on the right or left politically, and people answer, and so I can see that total percentage, and then I'll wait a while and then I'll ask another poll that's split. It'll be like, what is your political orientation, right or left, and then like, do you support XYZ, and then have people answer that. And so I can see the change in what people are reporting right or left when it's combined with another question that they know is leading. So I can see how much people are like faking their answers, basically. So there's like ways to do tests in Twitter itself to like determine how reliable certain factors are. So I like doing a lot of that stuff to sort of know. But regardless, I do have a pretty skewed audience. Like they're mostly male, mostly in STEM, for example. And the kind of people who follow me on Twitter are not representative of the general population. So I use it typically to sort of get a sense of things I want to dig into deeper. Like, for example, I found one of my most significant correlation that I've found in a Twitter poll is a relationship between anxiety and if you have IBS, which is out of all of the polls that I've done polls where it's like, are you male or female? Like, would you fuck a stranger? And like the greater result from that is the IBS and anxiety one. So anyway, it even if it's like not like a full, it has its limitations, you can still use it as like really interesting pointers if you want to do a more full-fledged survey. And then I do occasionally run like much more full-fledged surveys, typically really heavily informed by the Twitter polls that I've been doing.
And that's really interesting. And by the way, when I said like Twitter polls, how much can I do with them? I think the number one sort of drawback that was in my mind was basically like what you said, your audience isn't representative of like a larger audience. Like you can't really extrapolate the results. They're not necessarily representative of like any particular audience that you can define. And for me, it's even more extreme because it's a much smaller audience. And like, I think you said, one thing we might have in common between our audiences, besides maybe a crypto edge, is, it's just like such a large percentage that's male. And that like sort of, I mean, that's fine. Like you can just assume that the surveys are for like all males or something. But I just feel that the audience is so specific, like given just how big the internet is, like these couple of thousand people sort of landed on my page, that it's so specific as to be almost not really, the results aren't really useful, I suppose. But maybe when you get up to like the numbers where you're at, it sounds like you're finding some interesting results, and you've sort of come up with these principles, I'll call them, to try to sort of hack the system a little bit, like, asking, you mentioned like, are you on the left or on the right? And then a couple of weeks later, asking a question with that as a part of it and seeing people like change their answers. I think that's pretty interesting. Do you have any other like sort of tools up your sleeve that you've discovered over your time doing this that are things that are just like regularly top of mind as you're creating these polls in terms of like how to make things more effective or uncover interesting results, things like that?
Yeah. One thing is like reducing trolling is really fun because Twitter polls are super easily trollable. People pick things that they don't believe, but you can reduce this, or you can test the amount of trolling. Like I have a series of polls that I do sometimes where it's like asking people, what is 2 + 2? And then I have the answers. And then I ask people like, what is like 2 + 2 × 8? And then I slowly have like an increasing complexity of the math problem. And then the troll answers, like it gets more correct the more complex the math problem, which is really funny, which means that like people sort of are answering as signaling. Like they're clicking the answer based on how much like they get to represent their identity in the response. So like if it's 2 + 2, they're not like, they know that everybody knows that they know that it's 4. So that there's nothing lost in selecting like 5. But as soon as there might be something lost in selecting 5, then the accuracy of the answers, or like at least people's attempted like accuracy for self-reporting, really goes up. So I tend to trust polls a lot more when it has something at stake for somebody's personal identity when they're answering. But if there's nothing at stake, like if they lose nothing by people thinking of them as somebody who answers a wrong answer, then we have like a significantly greater troll response. And then if I bring those particular troll response vulnerable questions into a larger survey, then I do like greater details to try and prevent it, like having deliberately confusing or sorry, contradicting questions. And if they answer, opposite ways on them, then I delete their answers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think like a lot of these insights you're having around polling are pretty, I don't know if you like sort of formally study like surveying or the like. I think you'd spent some time in statistics, but some of these observations are like not obvious to me at all. And then when you say them though, they make like a ton of sense. What areas within research, not like formal areas necessarily, but just like interests, are you most, I guess, do you find yourself now most exploring? And sort of if you could just do whatever you want and have like the perfect audience and all the funding and everything you need, what are like the most interesting areas for you to you know, do these surveys and do research on?
The perfect audience and everything. That's such a huge question. Um, I'm not doing a ton of like right now. I'm mostly getting tutored in statistics, like just knowing how to interpret data better and like how to control for things and whatnot. But I don't really study things beyond that, which like might be a flaw. But for what I want to study, like I mentioned, sexual fetishes, I really want to know where things come from is a big one. I also want to know a lot about like relationships and polyamory and monogamy and relationship length and like the kinds of things that happen that cause greater relationship length. That's like a little bit of a side project right now. But there's so many other things. Like I'm also really interested in like the kinds of things that cause, I'm trying to think of like a more charitable term than woke, but like the really aggressive ideology that some extreme left people tend to have. I'm really curious about like what corresponds with that, like and how people's behaviors and mentalities around that change if you like change some variables. I'm also curious about how that differs from the kind of extreme ideology on the right. Like what kinds of things are they thinking that are very different, and which ways are they very similar? So those would probably be the 3 main topics I'm most interested in.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting set of areas and very diverse. But I like I've already just in like looking through your Twitter polls here and there, like I see results that are really surprising to me. And I think that alone makes for sort of like an interesting, like if you can get a really interesting result that's super unexpected, um, it seems that you're asking an interesting question to me at least. I don't know, like even I feel like I don't have to be that interested in the subject. Um, where if if you can just like surprise me with some feedback from a reasonably large audience, then like that in and of itself is interesting, sort of regardless of the subject. So would certainly be curious to follow what you're doing in all of these areas. I know we've been on for a while now and won't spend too much longer, but I do want to touch a bit on your experience with psychedelics because I thought your writing on it was like really exceptional, and like it just was really interesting to read. Basically, you correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but you had spent like 10 months, and maybe you could place this in time because I'm not sure exactly where it was over your sort of story that you've told so far, but you spent like 10 months um, doing pretty high doses of LSD for like on a weekly basis, I think, and wrote about that experience and like coming out of it. Um, and I guess, the best place to start, like I read the thing, so I sort of have the background, but for those who don't, maybe you could just sort of give the quick voiceover. And then I have like a couple questions based on what you wrote, and maybe what you say here that I think would just be interesting to hear your response to.
Sure. As a general overview, when I was 22, I did acid. I had a really, really great time. And then I was like, maybe I should do more acid. And then I just kept doing acid. It was on average once a week. Like sometimes it was multiple times, like a couple days apart. Sometimes it was like 2 weeks apart, but roughly it was around 40 times. And I definitely experienced a pretty severe change over the course of those 10 months. Um, like the first part was pretty vibrant. Like I produced a huge amount of art. It was very sort of active and invigorating. It made me like engage with the world more, maybe become like pretty evangelical. I consider this my evangelical stage where I wanted to tell everybody about psychedelics and be like, we should dose the water supply with psychedelics. Um, and then over time, like it just kept, it was like a process of deconstruction, right? And so like the first part to go was sort of like a lot of norms I had about the world and society and reality in my mind. And once those norms were gone, I had sort of the next layer down, which I was very excited and evangelical about, which is like, oh, you know, art and we are all one and all this stuff. But then like that sort of also got deconstructed, and then things started getting a lot weirder, a lot more unrealistic or unreal. Uh, and then by the end of it, it was like felt like I was tripping even when I wasn't. Like when I wasn't on acid, it was still, I was like I was still in that water anyway. And I became like pretty non-functional. I was camming at the time, but I gradually just stopped camming because it's like if I don't want to do camming, why should I do it? It just doesn't feel good to do in that moment. And I was totally at peace with it. I sort of felt like I was dead. I felt like I was in a waking dream at all times. It was awesome. It might sound a little weird when I talk about it, but I think about that state with like a great deal of love, I think.
So
And yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead.
And then eventually, when I realized that if I kept doing LSD, I would probably physically die. Like the path that I was going down was one of sort of very intense inaction. And I was like, okay, I might become a homeless person on the street, just cold and freezing to death, because I just am not moving anymore. And I was totally okay with that. I was like, yeah, I could be a homeless person freezing to death on the street. But some part of me was like, I don't think I feel like dying. So maybe we should stop. I don't know. So I just kind of stopped doing LSD, and it took me about another month to return to roughly normal.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of would have expected it. It might have taken longer than a month to sort of come back from that. Obviously not like
It took about 10 months to come back from it. Sorry if I misspoke.
10 months. Okay, yeah, that sounds um more reasonable. So the couple of interesting things, well, one of the things you just said actually was like I might not be quoting you exactly, but it was like, you basically said I felt like I was dead. I felt like every day was like sort of a waking dream. It was awesome. Like that's not really what you would expect the third line to be after the first two. And I understand it's like probably hard to describe, but it relates to something that I had seen that you had written, which was that like, you're free of desire, and like everyone connects that with, not everyone, but people connect that with like the Buddha thing where it's like all I might be misquoting this, but like all suffering is desire. Um, Sort of known that like, if you don't really want anything, then it's like pretty hard to be unhappy in a way.
Mhm.
But then you also said like you didn't have any fear of death. And it started to sound like, and now you're saying like after several months of this, you start to like feel dead. It sounds like you're almost connecting this because like it's not like you're just going into these trips and like feeling dead. Like you're going into these trips and they're like super mind blowing and just indescribable, I imagine, and like just using language or whatever. Um, so like they're very like lively, I guess, experiences, but then you somehow start to feel like dead, and it connected for me. Like it sounds like sort of this understanding somehow leaves you feeling like universal in a way, like you get separated from your ego or whatever, but also dead. I guess it's hard to understand that. Can you speak to that at all, or does that not really make
Yeah.
sense?
There's a way in which like you are your body, obviously, but you don't feel like your body. Like I don't feel like I'm doing my digestion. It's not like a conscious process, and I don't associate with my ego. And so there's a way where like a lot of my conscious processes sort of got converted from being like a thought that I'm thinking to something like digestion, where it's sort of like I am not performing that thought. I'm sort of noticing that that thought gets performed, kind of in the way that I notice food gets digested. And that was just cool. Like it still happens. It's still part of me. but I'm no longer associated with it. And so like turn that knob up like really far, and then you sort of becomes like all of your experience like no longer is you. And if it's no longer you, like what are you? And so like being dead in a way sort of means that like the thing that you used to identify as you is now suddenly your body. Like it's dead in the way that your digestion is dead, or like other people are dead to you. Like you are not experiencing their experience in
Mm.
that sort of way. Um, and so in that, I was like, who am I? I cannot find myself. I would like look for the thing that was like the me, the ego, the identity, and it was just like sand. It would fall through my fingers, and I'd be like, oh, there's nothing here. I must be dead. I'm using the word a little bit poetically. I don't mean
Mm.
literally like I am beyond the grave, uh, but rather that it was like, how do I convey the sensation that the thing that used to be here no longer is? I know that I am acting and moving and speaking. It might be similar to what people talk about, like the pea zombie conception. Like if somebody could be there and talking, but like there's no conscious experience. Except I was deeply conscious. Like I was very aware of what was going on. It's just that I was not there to be aware of it. If that makes sense, it's a little bit of nonsense, but
Oh yeah, I think I follow, and it's like a useful description. Certainly changes like how I was thinking about the you using the word death a little bit. It's almost like, I think there is a lot of value to, especially for people who are like very emotional, to sort of remove yourself from that and be like, instead of I am angry, it's like I'm feeling anger or whatever, right? I forget what the exact like turn of phrase is, but you just sort of disassociate from what's like consuming you and look at things from like a third party perspective. And I think that's really useful in a lot of cases. And it sounds like this was somewhat that, like to the very extreme where you just like sort of stop viewing things as yourself in a way.
yeah,
Um,
there's some way where like there's often a little bit of a misconception that goes on, not that you're doing it, but that it's like often done, where like the disassociation is associated with like not feeling the thing, which was absolutely not what was going on. I was feeling extremely intensely everything, like including pain. Like this was not a way of not feeling pain, right? Like I was in pretty intense agony for quite a lot of it. So it definitely was disassociation in a sense, but also it was very intense.
during during the trip or in between, you're feeling like
Both,
these overwhelming senses.
both.
So the during sort of what's the word? Emphasizes like the in between in a way, like it sort of spills out a little bit, or is that not right?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I just knew that like I would take the drug and have a trip, and I would sort of come down, and then just sort of there was still some of it in me. Like the very first time I tripped, it was like sort of my brain opened up, like a pupil dilating. And I was like, so much information. And then you come down and the pupil squints back, and then you kind of forget about it. It's like waking up from a dream. Like the information is sort of lost, and you know that there was something important there, but it's kind of gone. But you maybe remember a little bit. And so for me, it was like I want to go back and remember more. So I would do it again, everything would dilate, and then it would come back, and I would maybe have taken back like 1 more%. And so I was like, I just want to take back more. And so like after many, many trips, like at that point, I had just taken back a lot, like managed to somehow pull a lot of that experience into my waking life. And so that's how I think it bled over.
And then so like 10 months into this or so, you decide like, you're feeling dead. It's awesome, but you want to, the quote I think from your writing was, I wanted to stop knowing. You wanted to sort of, come back, I guess, for layman's term. And I guess I don't know if it was obvious to you at the time, but like just for outsiders sort of hearing the story, it wouldn't be obvious to me that at that point you would be sort of capable of like coming back and sort of not changing your mind, but like, well, maybe literally changing your mind, but like coming back to a place where you are like, sort of identifying like whatever it was that we just described, you're not in that place anymore. You're closer to where you were before you started tripping. I guess you described the decision like it sort of maybe didn't even seem like a big deal at that time. But the journey coming back over the next 10 months, like how was that? How is that sort of gradually coming back from this sort of altered state that you were living in for a while?
Yeah, the decision itself was really interesting. And I feel like that's like maybe the one thing I don't fully understand. It feels like it happened to me. It feels like I didn't make a decision. It felt like it was inevitable. Like it was like an inevitable part of that journey that once you hit a certain point, you just go back. It's kind of the way that I process it now. So like, oh, I hit the point and now I just went back. Um, and the journey back was really hard. Like I decided like, okay, if I'm going to live, then I need to stop knowing what it is that I am. And I feel like like body sensations talking about this right now. And so I tried like really actively to like create my ego again, and really attach to feelings of like anxiety or insecurity or jealousy and all the stuff that is pretty classically associated with ego. And it felt great. It felt great. I was like, this means I'm alive. This means I'm a person with like opinions. Like I'm so concrete. Like I have a character, and the character is so fun to be in. And to some extent, this I still feel like this. I'm now like a pretty well-formed character. Like it's been many years since that experience, and I do LSD maybe once or twice a year since then, not very much, to like sort of keep the edge on, right? but, but at this point, I feel very much like a pretty well-formed character. I feel legitimate anxiety and anger and judgment of other people. But there's like a part of me here that I didn't have before, which is like a really deep delight in that. Before I did LSD, I felt all the same things, but there wasn't a delight in it. And now it's like almost like a part of me is constantly choosing it. Like, yes, this is the thing that I am, and this is the thing that I want. And it's wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I think we'll end it there. Or actually, I sort of I do want to comment on that actually because I think it's interesting. Like choosing can make a huge difference, even if the thing is sort of the same, I feel. And so,
Mm.
if you sort of previously were just living because that's like the obvious thing to do, but then you went down this, other path and chose to come back to where, to not like tripping LSD all the time and whatever sort of comes with that. And just by making the choice, it's like if you're forget where I heard this analogy or whatever, so credit where credit is due or whatever, but like if you're forced to run, a marathon or even further, whatever it might be, or else like you like something bad happens, like you're threatened to do that, then like that is like horrific. But people choose to run marathons all the time and describe it as like the best thing they've ever done, and an awesome experience. And that just goes to show it's like the same exact experience in terms of what you're physically doing, but choosing to do it makes all the difference. And so I wonder if that's sort of a component for you where ever since that period of your life, you've sort of, in the back of your head, that everything that happens, you've sort of chosen to be around for it in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really lovely way of putting it. Like even things that aren't strictly my choice, like things that other people do and then I feel sad about it. Or like terrible things in the world, like every experience that passes through my brain is my choice. Like it is by being here, I am choosing to give life to it. Uh, and it's great.
Awesome. Well, let's end there. Really, really interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it. I know a lot of other people listening are going to enjoy it, so I appreciate you coming on and
Yeah, thank you
and
so
taking the
much.
time. Yep. Where can we point people who want to learn more, from you and read your stuff and follow along your journey, which I'm sure will continue to be very interesting from here. If the past is any indication, where can they go and follow you online or otherwise?
Yeah, my Twitter is Aella Girl, AELLA underscore girl. And my website is knowingless.com, like KNOW, knowingless.com.